Robbed of her life's savings and her home by her gambling addict son, an elderly mother is pushed to the absolute brink. This is her incredible story of unimaginable sacrifice and unwavering faith in his redemption. Can she save him, and in doing so, find her own peace? My name is Martha, and for 72 years, I believed the cornerstone of my life, the very bedrock upon which my quiet existence was built, was the love I held for my only son, David. I thought that love was a fortress, unbreachable, a sacred thing. I learned, with the kind of brutal clarity that strips away all illusions, that even fortresses can be razed to the ground by the ones you trust most to guard them. And yet, what I also learned, what still astounds me to this day, is what can rise from those ashes when a mother's heart refuses to stop beating, even when it's been shattered into a million pieces. It didn't happen all at once, this devastation. Evil rarely arrives with a thunderclap and a puff of smoke. It creeps in on slippered feet, disguised as a familiar shadow, a whispered plea, a beloved face etched with a worry you'd move heaven and earth to erase. David was always a charmer, my boy. Even as a child, he had a smile that could melt the coldest heart, and a way with words that could talk a bird right out of a tree. His father, my dear departed Frank, used to say David could sell sand in the Sahara. Frank meant it as a compliment, a testament to his son's quick wit and persuasive nature. I see now, with the bitter wisdom of hindsight, that it was also a warning. After Frank passed on 20 years ago, leaving me with our small, paid-for house on Elm Street and a modest pension that, with careful budgeting, allowed me a simple but comfortable life, David became the center of my world. He was grown, of course, with a life of his own, a series of short-lived jobs, even shorter-lived relationships, but he always knew his way back to his mama's kitchen, to my listening ear, to my ever-open, if sometimes depleted, purse. He'd come to me with dreams as big as the sky, a new business venture, an investment that was a sure thing, a course he needed to take to turn his life around. And I, like a fool blinded by love, or perhaps by a desperate need to see my son succeed, to see him happy, would dip into my savings, the nest egg Frank and I had painstakingly built over decades of hard work and sacrifice. "It's for your future, Mama," he'd say, his eyes earnest, his hand covering mine. "I'll pay you back double, you'll see." I rarely saw a dime back, of course. The business ventures would crumble, the sure things would evaporate, the courses would be abandoned halfway through. There was always an excuse, a string of bad luck, a partner who'd cheated him. And I'd sigh, my heart aching for his disappointments, and then I'd forgive him, because what else could a mother do? He was my son, my only child, the last living piece of my Frank. The gambling. I suppose I knew about it, in a vague, ostrich with its head in the sand kind of way. He'd mention a friendly poker game now and then, or a small flutter on the horses. I'd warn him, tell him it was a fool's game, but he'd just laugh it off, tell me not to worry my gray head about it, that he knew his limits. Oh, how I wish I'd seen the abyss he was skirting, the one he was slowly, deliberately, pulling me towards with him. The first truly alarming sign came about a year ago. He'd been more agitated than usual, his visits more frequent, his requests for money more urgent, more desperate. He looked thin, his eyes shadowed, that charming smile strained and brittle. He spoke of debts, of needing to clear his name, of one last big win that would solve everything. I gave him what I could, my savings dwindling, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I started to hide my bank statements, to dread the ring of the phone. Then came the day he asked me about the house, our house, the only real asset I possessed, the sanctuary Frank had worked his fingers to the bone to secure for us. "Mama," he'd said, his voice a low, persuasive murmur, his eyes avoiding mine. "I've got this incredible opportunity, a real estate deal. Guaranteed returns. But I need collateral. Just for a short while. If I could just use the house papers as a guarantee?" It's just a formality, Mama. I'd never let anything happen to our home. I should have said no. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to refuse. But he was my son, and he looked so broken, so desperate. He swore on his father's grave it was safe, that it was his only way out of the mess he was in. He painted a picture of a bright future, where he'd not only repay me but set me up like a queen. Blinded by love, by fear for him, by a lifetime of enabling his dreams, I relented. I signed the papers he put before me, papers I barely understood, their dense legal jargon a blur to my tired eyes. He'd kissed my cheek, his own cool and damp, and promised me I wouldn't regret it. Regret. That word doesn't even begin to cover the black, bottomless pit of despair that opened up beneath me 3 months later. It was a Tuesday, I remember. A cold, gray November morning. There was a knock on the door. Not David's cheerful, familiar rap, but a hard, official-sounding series of thumps. 2 men in somber suits stood on my porch. They didn't smile. They handed me another set of papers, these ones even more terrifying, more incomprehensible than the ones David had given me. Foreclosure. Eviction notice. The house, my home, Frank's legacy, had been leveraged against David's gambling debts, taken out through some predatory lender using the papers I had so foolishly signed. And he had lost it all. Every last cent he could wring from its value had vanished into the insatiable maw of a casino, a place I'd only ever seen in movies, a glittering den of thieves. I remember sinking to my knees on the worn linoleum of my kitchen floor, the eviction notice fluttering from my numb fingers. The world tilted, spun, then went black. My son, my beloved David, hadn't just gambled away my home, he'd gambled away my life, my security, my past, my future. He had betrayed me. He had robbed his own mother. And I was left with nothing but the crushing weight of his deception, and the terrifying prospect of homelessness in the winter of my life. The cold of the linoleum seeped into my bones, a chilling premonition of the desolation that awaited me. How long I lay there, crumpled amidst the ruins of my life, I don't know. It could have been minutes or an eternity. The world had narrowed to the frantic, painful thumping of my own heart, and the echo of those terrible words: foreclosure, eviction. Eventually, a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson's daughter, Clara, who had a key for emergencies since Frank passed, found me. She'd seen the official-looking car, the grim-faced men, and had come over, her kind face etched with concern. She helped me up, her strong arms a temporary bulwark against the abyss that had opened before me. She made me tea, her movements gentle, her words soothing, though I barely registered them. All I could think of was David. My son. How could he? The first thing I did, once a semblance of strength returned to my trembling limbs, was try to call him. My David. Surely there was some mistake, some terrible misunderstanding. He wouldn't do this to me. Not knowingly. The phone rang and rang, a hollow, mocking sound in the suddenly alien silence of my own home. No answer. I tried his cell, the number he'd given me for emergencies. It went straight to voicemail, his charming, recorded voice a fresh stab of pain. "Hey, it's Dave. Leave a message and I'll get back to you when I'm not out conquering the world." Conquering the world. He'd conquered mine, all right. Smashed it to pieces. I must have called a dozen times that day, each unanswered ring chipping away at the fragile hope that this was all a nightmare from which I would soon awaken. Clara stayed with me, a silent, compassionate presence. She tried to get me to eat, to rest, but food turned to ash in my mouth, and sleep was a distant, unattainable shore. The eviction notice gave me 30 days. 30 days to vacate the home where I had raised my son, where I had loved and lost my husband, where every nook and cranny held a memory. 30 days to pack up a lifetime of hoarded treasures and broken dreams. 30 days to become homeless. At 72. The days that followed were a blur of bewildered activity and crushing despair. Clara, bless her heart, helped me sort through my belongings, her practicality a lifeline in my sea of grief and confusion. What do you keep when you have nowhere to go? Frank's old fishing trophies? David's baby shoes, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. My wedding dress, yellowed with age but still smelling faintly of cedar and old promises? Each item was a fresh wave of pain, a reminder of what had been, and what would never be again. I tried to find David. I called his old haunts, the few friends of his whose numbers I had. No one had seen him. He had vanished, leaving me to face the wreckage he had created. The anger, when it finally came, was a cold, hard knot in my chest. How could he be so cruel, so thoughtless? After everything I had done for him, every sacrifice I had made? The charming boy with the irresistible smile was a monster, a thief who had stolen not just my home, but my trust, my security, my very sense of self. And yet, even in the depths of that anger, a terrible, aching love for him persisted. It was a sickness, I told myself, a mother's foolish, incurable malady. He was my son, my flesh and blood. The baby I had held in my arms, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed better, the young man whose dreams I had so desperately wanted to believe in. How do you stop loving your child, even when he has destroyed you? The 30 days dwindled with terrifying speed. I found a small furnished room to rent on the other side of town, in a run-down boarding house that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and hopelessness. It was all I could afford with the last of my meager savings, the money I had foolishly not given to David. Packing the few boxes I could take with me felt like packing for my own funeral. The day I handed over the keys to my house on Elm Street, the house Frank had bought with his sweat and dreams, was the hardest day of my life since Frank himself had passed. I didn't look back as the taxi drove away. I couldn't. My new room was small, dingy, with a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. This was my life now. This was what my son's love, or his addiction, or his desperation, whatever name you wanted to put to his betrayal, had brought me to. But even there, in that bleak little room, as I lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, the thought of David, my lost boy, would creep in. Where was he? Was he safe? Was he eating? Did he even realize the extent of the devastation he had caused? And a tiny, treacherous voice would whisper in the darkest corners of my heart, if he came back, if he needed me, would I turn him away? I didn't know the answer then. I only knew the pain and the hollow, aching space where my life used to be. The journey ahead was a terrifying unknown, a path shrouded in the fog of betrayal and loss, but somewhere, deep inside, a flicker of that stubborn, foolish maternal love refused to be extinguished.
A tiny ember glowing amidst the ruins.
The first week in that cramped, musty room at Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house felt like a descent into a special kind of hell, one reserved for mothers discarded by the very children they'd breathed life into. My new home, if you could call it that, was a shoebox with a sagging mattress, a single grimy window that offered a thrilling vista of a soot-stained brick wall, and a shared bathroom down the hall that always smelled faintly of despair and cheap disinfectant. The vibrant, if worn comfort of my little house on Elm Street, with its scent of baking and Frank's pipe tobacco, felt like a dream from another lifetime, a paradise lost. And all because of David, my David. Waking up each morning was an act of sheer will. The first thought that pierced through the fog of restless sleep was always the same. This is not a nightmare. This is real. He did this to me. The pain would be a fresh physical blow, leaving me breathless, curled under the thin, scratchy blanket, a 72-year-old woman who had lost everything. Everything but the aching, stubborn love for the son who had brought her to this. How does a heart hold so much anguish and so much love at the same time? It felt like it would tear itself apart. Survival. That became my mantra, my daily, hourly struggle. The small amount of cash I'd managed to keep hidden from David's increasingly desperate pleas in those final months before the disaster was dwindling with terrifying speed. Rent for the room, however miserable, had to be paid weekly. Food, even the cheapest kind, day-old bread, bruised apples, watery soup from a can, cost money. My pension, Frank's legacy, was small, barely enough to cover my old utility bills. Now it felt like a king's ransom one week and a pittance the next. I tried to find work. At my age, with hands gnarled by arthritis and a heart heavy with grief, what could I offer? I walked the streets, my pride a tattered flag I tried to keep flying, inquiring at local diners for dishwashing jobs, at small grocery stores for a few hours of sweeping or stocking shelves. The polite refusals, the pitying glances, were almost harder to bear than outright scorn. "We're not hiring right now, ma'am. You should be home enjoying your retirement, dear." Enjoying my retirement. The irony was a bitter pill. Some days, the despair was a thick, suffocating blanket. I'd sit on the edge of that lumpy mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper, the image of David's charming, deceitful face swimming before my eyes. How could he? Where was he? Did he even care that his mother was reduced to this? The anger would flare then, hot and righteous, and I'd curse his name, curse the day he was born, curse my own foolish, indulgent heart. But then, inevitably, the anger would fade, leaving behind only the familiar, soul-deep ache of a mother's love. I'd remember him as a baby, his tiny hand clutching my finger. I'd see him as a boy, his face alight with mischief, bringing me a fistful of wilting dandelions, as if they were the rarest orchids. And I'd pray for his safety, pray for his soul, pray that somehow, somewhere, he would find his way back from the darkness that had consumed him. I started rationing my food, one small meal a day, sometimes less. Hunger became a familiar companion, a dull ache in my belly that I tried to ignore by reading the tattered Bible I'd brought with me, its well-worn pages a source of fragile comfort. The Psalms, especially, spoke to my weary soul, tales of suffering, of faith tested, of hope in the face of desolation. The loneliness was a different kind of hunger, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of food could fill. Back on Elm Street, I'd had my neighbors, Clara, the ladies from my church quilting circle. Here, I was a ghost, an anonymous old woman in a house full of other lost souls, each locked in their own private miseries. The occasional nod in the hallway, the shared scent of stale cooking and unwashed bodies, that was the extent of my human contact. I missed my children, Marcus and Sarah May, terribly, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the full extent of my predicament. They had their own lives, their own worries. They'd helped with Frank's funeral, sent what little money they could spare afterwards, but I knew they weren't wealthy. How could I burden them with the knowledge that their mother was living in squalor, all because of their brother's catastrophic betrayal? My pride, what little remained of it, wouldn't allow it. I'd make vague, cheerful-sounding excuses when they called, speak of settling in, of finding my feet. The lies tasted like ash in my mouth. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the boarding house finally fell into a fitful silence, I'd take out the one photograph of David the First still possessed, a snapshot from a happier time, before the shadows had claimed him, his arm around my shoulder, both of us smiling into the summer sun. I'd trace the lines of his beloved, treacherous face with a trembling finger, and the tears I'd held back all day would finally fall, hot and silent, onto the faded image. "Oh, David," my heart would cry, my son, what have you done to us? What have you done to yourself?" Despite everything, despite the raw wound of his betrayal, the primal, unbreakable cord of maternal love still tethered me to him. If he were to walk through that door right now, broken, repentant, needing help, what would I do? The question haunted my sleepless nights. The title I'd once seen somewhere, the one that echoed in my soul. He betrayed and robbed his own mother, Yet I gave everything, believing in his healing. Was that to be my story? Was I truly capable of such forgiveness, such sacrifice, after he had brought me to this? The answer, I feared, was yes. A terrible, foolish, inevitable yes. Because he was my son. And I was his mother. And some bonds, it seemed, were forged in a fire too deep for even the cruelest betrayal to extinguish. The days in Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of scrimping, saving, and silent suffering. I learned to make a single can of soup last for 2 meals, to darn the thinning elbows of Frank's old cardigan until there were more darns than original wool. I learned the routes of the city buses that offered senior discounts, riding them to nowhere in particular sometimes, just to feel a part of the moving world, to escape the 4 oppressive walls of my tiny room for a few precious hours. The library became a sanctuary, its warmth and quiet a blessed relief, its books a temporary escape from my own bleak reality. I'd lose myself in stories of faraway lands, of lives lived with grace and plenty, a stark contrast to my own. But even amidst the pages of a novel, David was never far from my thoughts. Where was he? Was he eating? Did he have a roof over his head? The anger I felt towards him was a constant, burning ember, but beneath it, the worry, the maternal fear, was a raging inferno. He was a grown man, I'd tell myself sternly. He'd made his bed, let him lie in it. But then I'd remember him as a child, vulnerable and needing me, and my resolve would crumble. One particularly cold afternoon, a gnawing desperation took hold. I had to try to find him, or at least find out what had become of him. I wrapped myself in my threadbare coat, pulled Frank's old woolen hat down over my ears, and set out. I started with the few addresses I had for his old acquaintances, men he'd sometimes mentioned, usually in connection with some ill-fated business venture. The first few places were dead ends, doors unanswered, buildings abandoned or repurposed. The city felt vast, indifferent, a concrete jungle that had swallowed my son whole. Then, at a rundown apartment building on the south side, a place that smelled of stale beer and uncollected garbage, a bleary-eyed woman with a cigarette dangling from her lips finally recognized his name. "David? Oh, you mean Lucky Dave," she said, a harsh, humorless laugh escaping her. "Yeah, he was around here for a while. Always chasing a big score, that one. Haven't seen him in weeks, though. Heard he got into some trouble, owed some bad people a lot of money." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Bad people. A lot of money. My son, my charming, foolish David, was not just a gambler who had ruined his mother. He was a man in danger, a man entangled with a world I couldn't even begin to imagine. The walk back to Mrs. O'Malley's felt endless, each step heavier than the last. The cold seeped into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread that gripped my heart. He wasn't just lost to me, he was lost to himself, caught in a spiral of debt and desperation. That night, sleep was impossible. The image of David, hunted and afraid, tormented me. My anger, which had been a shield of sorts, began to crumble, replaced by a raw, overwhelming fear for him. Yes, he had betrayed me. Yes, he had destroyed my life. But he was still my son. And if he was in trouble, truly in trouble, what wouldn't a mother do? The question hung in the stale air of my little room, a silent vow taking root in the desolate landscape of my heart. I had nothing left to give, or so I thought. I had no money, no home, only a body growing frailer by the day and a love that refused to die, a love that now felt like both a curse and a sacred, unbearable responsibility. I looked at my gnarled hands, hands that had cooked and cleaned and mended for over 70 years, hands that had held my husband and cradled my children. They were empty now, but they were not useless. There had to be something I could do, some way I could reach him, some sacrifice I could still make, however small, however futile it might seem. The path was dark, uncertain, fraught with dangers I couldn't yet name. But as I lay there, staring into the oppressive darkness, a tiny, defiant spark ignited within me. He was my son, and I would not abandon him to the wolves, not while there was still breath in my body. My struggle for survival had just taken on a new, more desperate dimension. It was no longer just about me. It was about him, and about the impossible, unbreakable, and perhaps ultimately ruinous power of a mother's love. The words of that woman at the run-down apartment building, "Owed some bad people a lot of money," echoed in my mind, a relentless, terrifying drumbeat. My David, my foolish, charming boy, wasn't just a gambler who'd broken his mother's heart and stolen her home. He was a hunted animal, cornered by predators I couldn't even name. The image of him, desperate and afraid, eclipsed my own misery, fanning the last embers of my maternal instinct into a fierce, protective blaze. I had to do something. But what could an old woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a room in a charity case boarding house possibly do? The answer, when it came, was as stark and unpalatable as the stale bread I'd had for breakfast. I had one thing left of value, one thing that connected me to Frank, to our 53 years of shared life, to the woman I used to be. My wedding band. Frank had slipped it onto my finger on a bright June day so long ago, his eyes shining with a love that had felt as solid and enduring as the gold itself. It wasn't a fancy ring, just a simple, unadorned gold band, worn thin and smooth with the passage of decades. But it was my most precious possession, a symbol of everything I held sacred. And now it was the only currency I had left to try and buy my son's safety, perhaps even his life. The thought of parting with it sent a shard of ice through my heart. It felt like another betrayal, a desecration of Frank's memory. But what would Frank have wanted? He had loved David fiercely, despite his flaws. He would have understood. He would have moved heaven and earth for his son. And so would I. Finding out who David owed money to and how to reach them was the next terrifying hurdle. I couldn't go back to that apartment building. The woman there had already looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I needed another way. My mind, sharpened by desperation, began to work. David had sometimes frequented a smoky little bar downtown, a place called the Rusty Mug, where he claimed to meet business contacts. It was a long shot, a dangerous one for an old woman like me, but it was the only lead I had. That afternoon, I put on my best, and only, clean dress, Frank's old hat pulled low to shield my face, as much as to ward off the autumn chill, and took the bus downtown. The Rusty Mug was even more dilapidated and unwelcoming than I had imagined. Its windows were grimy, its door scarred, and the sounds emanating from within, loud, raucous laughter and the clink of glasses, made my stomach clench with apprehension. I almost turned back, but the image of David, hunted and afraid, spurred me on. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped into a dim, smoke-filled room. A few rough-looking men were hunched over a pool table, their voices coarse. Others sat at the bar, nursing beers, their eyes hard and watchful. The bartender, a burly man with a face like a crumpled road map, gave me a cursory, dismissive glance. I felt a lifetime away from my quiet little house on Elm Street, from my church quilting circle, from the gentle rhythms of my old life. This was David's world now, or at least a part of it, and it terrified me. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I approached the bar. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I'm looking for someone who might know David Sterling. My son." The bartender wiped a glass with a dirty rag, his eyes appraising me coldly. "Never heard of him." My heart sank, but I couldn't give up. He sometimes comes here. Tall, charming, talks a good game." One of the men at the bar snorted. "Sounds like half the losers in this town." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back. I would not break down here. He He might owe some people money, I said, forcing the words out. I need to help him. The bartender's expression changed almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something, interest? Calculation? Passed through his eyes. He leaned forward. And who might you be, ma'am? I'm his mother, I said, my voice gaining a fraction more strength. And I need to know who he's in debt to. I want to try and settle it. He was silent for a long moment, studying me. Then he jerked his head towards a dark, curtained-off booth in the corner. Man named Vinny sometimes sits back there. He knows a lot of what goes on. Might know your boy, might not. And if he does, he ain't gonna talk for free. Vinny. The name sounded like something out of one of those gangster movies Frank used to watch. My fear intensified, but so did my resolve. I clutched my worn purse, the wedding band inside feeling like a lead weight, a small, desperate offering to the wolves. I thanked the bartender, my voice trembling, and made my way towards the curtained booth. My legs felt like lead, each step an effort. Pushing aside the heavy velvet curtain, I found myself in a small, even darker alcove. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, illuminating a round table and two men. One was large, brutish-looking, his eyes small and mean. The other, presumably Vinny, was slighter, older, with slicked-back gray hair, a cheap suit, and eyes that were as cold and dead as a winter sky. A half-empty bottle of whiskey and two dirty glasses sat on the table between them. "Well, well," Vinny said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, a predatory smile twisting his thin lips. "What have we here? Lost your way, Grandma?" My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. But I stood my ground. "Are you Vinny?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Depends who's askin'," he said, taking a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving my face. I'm David Sterling's mother," I said. "I was told you might know him. He's in some trouble. I want to help." Vinny chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "David Sterling. Lucky Dave, huh? Yeah, I know him. Your boy's got a talent for gettin' into trouble. And for making promises he can't keep." His smile vanished. "He owes some very serious people. A very serious amount of money, lady. Money he ain't got." "I know," I said, my voice small. "That's why I'm here. I want to pay what he owes. Or as much as I can." Both men looked at me then, a mixture of surprise and derision in their eyes. Vinny leaned back, a predatory gleam in his. "You pay his debts? Darlin', from the looks of you, you ain't got two nickels to rub together?" The humiliation was a burning coal in my chest. But I lifted my chin. "I have something," I said. I opened my purse and took out Frank's wedding band. It lay on my trembling palm, a small circle of gold that represented a lifetime of love and fidelity. This was my husband's. It's all I have left of any real value. Vinny looked at the ring, then at me. His eyes narrowed. The brutish man beside him snorted contemptuously. For a long, terrible moment, I thought they would laugh in my face, or worse. Then Vinny sighed, a strange, almost weary sound. He picked up the ring, turning it over in his thick fingers. "Gold, huh? Old? Not worth much in scrap, probably." He looked at me again, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something flicker in those dead eyes. Pity? Respect? Or maybe just a gambler's calculation. "All right, lady," he said finally, his voice still rough but without the earlier mockery. "Your boy's a loser, a real piece of work, but no one deserves to see their mother go through this." He pocketed the ring. "This ain't gonna cover even a tenth of what he owes, but I'll tell the guys he's connected with that his old lady came through, showed some heart. It might buy him some time. Might. No promises." He then scribbled something on a napkin, an address. If he's smart, he'll lay low there for a while. And if you're smart, you'll forget you ever saw me. He pushed the napkin across the table. Now get out of here. This ain't no place for you. I snatched the napkin, tears blurring my vision, a strangled sob caught in my throat. I'd sold Frank's ring, my last link to him, for a mite, for a sliver of time for a son who had destroyed me. It was a terrible, heartbreaking bargain. But it was a bargain I had made. This was my sacrifice. My first, perhaps, but as I stumbled out of that dark, smoky bar and back into the indifferent gray of the afternoon, I had a chilling premonition it wouldn't be my last. My love for David, it seemed, was a bottomless well of forgiveness, and a terrifying engine of self-destruction. The address Vinny had scrawled on that greasy napkin burned a hole in my pocket for 2 whole days. It was a name of a street I didn't know, in a part of town I'd always been warned to avoid, a place where shadows clung to the alleyways even at noon, and hope, like everything else, seemed to be in short supply. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to huddle in the relative anonymity of Mrs. O'Malley's dingy room, and mourn what was lost. But the image of David, my David, hunted and in the clutches of bad people, was a more potent, more terrifying force than any fear I had for myself. My wedding ring, Frank's sacred gold, had bought him time. But time alone wouldn't save him. He needed his mother. Even if he didn't know it, even if he didn't deserve it. So, on the 3rd morning, after a breakfast of weak tea and a prayer that felt more like a desperate plea, I set out. The bus ride was long, rattling through neighborhoods that grew progressively more derelict. When I finally got off at the stop Vinny's scrawled directions indicated, I found myself on a street that looked like it had been forgotten by God and man alike. Boarded-up storefronts stared like vacant eyes, overflowing trash cans spilled their guts onto the cracked sidewalks, and a few lost souls drifted like ghosts, their faces etched with a hopelessness that mirrored my own. The address was a tenement building, its brick facade stained with grime and graffiti, its windows either broken or covered with yellowed newspaper. A group of young men loitered on the stoop, their eyes cold and assessing as I approached. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum of fear, but I clutched my worn purse tighter and kept walking, my gaze fixed on the grimy entrance. I had to do this, for David. "Looking for someone, Grandma?" one of them called out, a sneer in his voice. I ignored him, pushing open the heavy, graffitied door and stepping into a dimly lit, foul-smelling hallway. The air was thick with the scent of stale cooking, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something acrid and chemical that made my stomach turn. Vinny's note had said, "Room 3B." The stairs creaked ominously beneath my feet as I ascended, each step an effort, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The hallway on the 3rd floor was even darker, lined with scarred, anonymous doors. I found 3B, my hand trembling as I raised it to knock. For a long moment, there was no answer, only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant wail of a siren. I knocked again, louder this time. "David?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. "David, it's Mama. Please, son, open the door." More silence. Then a faint shuffling sound from within, followed by the click of a lock being undone. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a darkened room and one bloodshot, wary eye that I knew as well as my own. "Mama?" David's voice was a hoarse croak, laced with disbelief and something else. "Shame? Fear? What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "Vinny," I said simply, my heart aching at the sight of him, at the state of him. "He told me where you might be. Can I come in, David?" He hesitated for a long moment, then slowly opened the door wider. The room was even worse than the hallway. Small, squalid, furnished with nothing but a stained mattress on the floor, a single broken chair, and an overflowing ashtray on a crate that served as a table. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke, unwashed clothes, and a despair so palpable it was like a physical weight. And David, my son, he looked like a ghost of himself. His clothes were rumpled and dirty, his face pale and unshaven, his eyes haunted, ringed with dark circles. He was thinner than I'd ever seen him, the charming confidence that had always been his hallmark completely gone, replaced by a hunted, desperate look. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Oh, David," I whispered, my anger, my resentment, all the bitter recriminations I'd rehearsed in my mind, dissolving in a fresh wave of overwhelming pity and a love that refused to be extinguished. He was my child, my broken, lost child. He flinched as if I'd struck him. "Don't, Mama," he mumbled, turning away, running a shaky hand through his greasy hair. "Don't look at me like that. I know what I did. I'm a mess. I'm no good." "You're my son, David," I said softly, stepping further into the room, my gaze taking in the utter desolation of his surroundings. "And I'm here." We stood there in silence for a long moment, the unspoken words, the accusations, the apologies, hanging heavy in the air between us. Then he seemed to crumple, his shoulders slumping, his head bowed. "They're going to kill me, Mama," he whispered, his voice raw with terror. "Vinny, he bought me sometime, I know. Someone told me an old lady. His guys said an old lady came asking, 'Was that you, Mama? Did you give him something?'" I simply nodded, my throat too tight for words. He looked up then, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and a dawning, horrified understanding. "Your ring? Frank's ring? Mama, no! How could you?" He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with ragged sobs. "Oh God, Mama, what have I done? What have I done to you?" Seeing him break down like that, seeing the genuine anguish in his eyes, something shifted within me. The anger was still there, a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective urgency. He was at rock bottom, he knew it. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment, the only moment, he might be willing to accept help, to try and climb out of the abyss he'd dug for himself. "It doesn't matter about the ring, David," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. "What matters is you. What matters is getting you out of this. Getting you well." He looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "But how, Mama? I've got nothing. I am nothing. And those people, they won't wait forever. Vinny's protection won't last." I took another deep breath. This was it. This was where my love, my belief in his healing, would be truly tested. I had no money, no resources, only a mother's desperate, unyielding heart. "We'll find a way, David," I said, trying to infuse my voice with a confidence I didn't feel. "We always have, haven't we? Your father, he always said we'd find a way." I walked over to him, and despite the filth, despite the shame that radiated from him, I did what my heart ached to do. I put my arms around my son, my lost, broken son, and held him close. "First," I said, pulling back slightly, looking into his ravaged face, "you need to eat. You need to clean yourself up. And then we need to get you help, son. Real help. For the gambling. Before it truly destroys you." He stared at me, a flicker of something. Hope? Resistance? In his eyes. "Help? Like a program? Mama, I can't. I don't have—" "We'll figure it out," I said, cutting him off, though my own heart quailed at the thought of how. "One step at a time. Right now, let's just get through today." And so began my new sacrifice. Not of gold this time, for I had none left, but of myself. My time, what little energy I possessed, my last vestiges of pride. I cleaned his squalid room as best I could. I used the few dollars I had left to buy him some soup and bread from a nearby bodega. I sat with him while he ate, coaxing him like a child. I listened to his fragmented, shame-filled confessions, his fears, his self-loathing. I didn't judge. I didn't scold. I just listened. And I prayed. It was a tiny, fragile beginning. A single candle lit in an overwhelming darkness. I didn't know if it would be enough. I didn't know if I would be enough. But as I watched David finally fall into an exhausted, troubled sleep on that stained mattress, a sliver of something akin to hope pierced through my own despair. He was here. He was alive. And he had, for the first time in a long time, let me in. Perhaps this was the start of his healing. And perhaps my love, my all-consuming, self-sacrificing mother's love, was not so foolish after all. The days that followed my reunion with David in that squalid little room were some of the hardest, and strangely, some of the most purposeful I had ever known. My own bleak existence in Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house faded into the background, as every ounce of my being became focused on one single, all-consuming goal: to pull my son back from the abyss. It was like tending to a dying plant, carefully nursing a flicker of life that threatened to be extinguished by the slightest breeze. David was broken, yes, shattered by guilt, consumed by self-loathing, and terrified of the men he owed money to. The first few days, he barely spoke, just lay on that stained mattress, staring at the ceiling, occasionally shaken by tremors of withdrawal or fear. I sat with him, sometimes talking softly about his childhood, about Frank, about anything but the present horror. I brought him food, what little I could afford or coax from the soup kitchen down the street, spooning it into him like he was a child again. I cleaned his room, battling the filth and despair with soap, water, and a prayer on my lips. The address Vinny had given me was more of a flophouse than an apartment building, a place where desperate souls went to disappear. There was no lock on David's door that worked, no sense of safety. Every creak in the hallway, every shout from a neighboring room, sent him into a fresh panic. My wedding ring had bought him time, but it was a fragile shield. We both knew it. My first small victory was convincing him to let me wash his clothes. It sounds like such a small thing, but for a man who had prided himself on his charm and appearance, to be reduced to such a state of neglect, it was a sign. He let me mother him, and in that surrender, I saw a tiny crack in the wall of his despair. The bigger challenge was getting him to face his addiction. The word gambling was like a raw nerve. He'd flinch, shut down, or lash out with a flash of his old defensive anger. "I'm not an addict, Mama," he'd insist, his voice hoarse. I had a run of bad luck. I can fix it. I just need one more chance, one good stake." And my heart would sink, because I knew that path led only to further ruin. "David," I'd say, my voice gentle but firm, trying to channel some of Frank's quiet strength. "Luck has nothing to do with it, son. This thing, it's got a hold of you. It's a sickness. And like any sickness, you need help to get well." I started looking for resources. The library, my sanctuary, provided pamphlets for Gamblers Anonymous, for debt counseling services, for mental health clinics that offered free or low-cost consultations. I'd bring them back to the room, leaving them where he might see them, not pushing, just offering. The sacrifice, for me, was no longer about material things. I had nothing left to give in that regard. It was a sacrifice of my own peace of mind, what little I had. It was battling my own exhaustion, my own fear, to project an image of hope and strength for him. It was enduring his moods, his despair, his occasional bitter accusations that I didn't understand. It was sitting with him through long sleepless nights when his cravings and his terrors were at their worst, holding his hand, praying over him, sometimes just humming the old lullabies I used to sing to him when he was a baby. It was a constant, draining, all-consuming act of will, fueled by a love that simply refused to give up. One afternoon, about a week into this new, grim routine, I found him staring at one of the GA pamphlets. He didn't say anything, just traced the letters with a trembling finger. "They meet down at the church basement on Tuesdays, David," I said softly. "Pastor Jenkins mentioned it. Just people talking, sharing their stories, no judgment." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, hunted look I'd seen too often. What if they find me there, Mama? Vinny's people? "I'll go with you, son," I said without hesitation. "I'll sit with you. No one will bother you with me there." The thought of facing those kinds of people again terrified me, but I pushed it down. My fear was secondary to his need. That first meeting was an ordeal. He almost bolted a dozen times before we even got there. He sat hunched in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor, while others spoke of their own struggles, their own rock bottoms. I sat beside him, my hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent anchor. He didn't speak that first time, nor the second. But he kept going back, with me. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. He started to listen. He started to talk, first to me, in halting, shame-filled whispers in the dead of night. Then, eventually, in the meetings, his voice raw with pain but also, for the first time, with a flicker of honesty. He spoke of the thrill of the win, the desperate chase to recoup losses, the lies, the deceptions, the crushing weight of the debts, the shame of what he'd done to me. And I listened. I listened without judgment, offering only love and understanding, though every word was a fresh twist of the knife in my own heart. My belief in his healing, the belief that had driven me to sacrifice everything, was a fragile thing, but it was all I had. The threat from Vinny's associates still loomed. We had no money to repay them. My wedding ring had been a pittance, a symbolic gesture at best. David lived in constant fear of a knock on the door that wasn't mine. Then one day a letter arrived at Mrs. O'Malley's for me. It was a plain white envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper and a small, tarnished gold locket. Frank's wedding band. My ring. The note was brief, typewritten. "Consider Mr. Sterling's debt to us settled. Seems he had an angel watching over him after all. Stay out of our business." It wasn't signed. Tears welled in my eyes as I clutched the ring. Vinny. For whatever reason, a flicker of conscience, a moment of pity, perhaps even a grudging respect for a mother's desperation, he had given me back the only material thing that mattered. And he had, it seemed, called off his dogs. It wasn't forgiveness from David's main creditors, I knew that. But it was a reprieve, a significant danger removed. When I showed David the ring, he broke down completely, a storm of tears and remorse that seemed to wash away years of deceit and self-destruction. "Mama," he sobbed, clutching my hand, "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve any of this." "Oh, David," I said, stroking his hair, my own tears flowing freely. "It's not about deserving, son. It's about love. And it's about healing. Now you have a chance. A real chance. Don't waste it." And he didn't. The road was long, and it wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of temptation, days when the darkness threatened to consume him again. But he kept fighting. He got a menial job, washing dishes, and for the first time in his adult life, he brought home a paycheck, however small, and insisted on contributing to our meager expenses. He started to smile again, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile I hadn't seen in years. He started to talk about the future, not with grand, unrealistic schemes, but with a quiet, humble hope. We never got the house on Elm Street back. That part of my life was gone forever. We lived simply, David and I, in two small, clean rooms I eventually found in a slightly better part of town, far from the despair of Mrs. O'Malley's. He continued his GA meetings, and I continued to support him, my love no longer blind and enabling, but clear-eyed, patient, and unwavering. There was no grand fortune, no miraculous reversal of our material circumstances. But what we found was something far more precious. We found forgiveness. We found healing. David began to rebuild his life, piece by painstaking piece, and in doing so, he helped me rebuild mine. The son I had lost to the shadows slowly began to re-emerge, a man humbled by his failures, but also strengthened by the enduring power of a love he finally understood he hadn't truly destroyed. My sacrifice, giving everything I had, believing in his healing, it hadn't been in vain. He was alive. He was trying. He was, slowly but surely, coming home. And for a mother's heart, that was a happy ending more precious than all the riches in the world. My quiet life was still quiet, still simple, but it was no longer filled with the raw ache of betrayal or the terror of homelessness. It was filled instead with a fragile, hard-won peace, and the enduring, resilient hope that my love, in the end, had indeed been enough to light his way back.